Absolutely, I would be very happy to. Well, think of it, in terms of what is a civilization to begin with. It's perhaps not something that's the easiest thing to measure, but I think we can all have a sense of what it entails. One thing would be um, a certain level of technology that might help define it. Another might be its idea of how the universe is structured, its cosmology, so to speak. Another might be its particular style of social beliefs and social interactions and so forth. And all of these types of things go in to make a distinctive civilization, I would argue. And in human history, we've had a variety of types of civilizations that have existed over the many millennia that we've had history. Now let's move into our own era and look at the clandestine black budget world that most of us are somewhat familiar with. This is a world that has a great deal of secret money that's gone into it. It has a great deal of secrecy and independence from much legal oversight. And as I also believe has come to happen, is that this is a world, at least some segments of it, have acquired certain types of exotic technology, let's call it ET or alien technology, that they have been able to study for a number of decades now. So let's imagine that we are part of that organization. We're part of this black budget world, and it's 1950, and we're part of a team of brilliant scientists, and our job is to study certain pieces of alien technology. Now, within that situation, after a certain period of time, some of us would have a eureka moment where we might be able to make breakthroughs in our understanding of that technology. And some of these breakthroughs might allow us to make money off of our understanding. We might make better integrated circuits or high tensile fibers or fiber optics or things of this particular sort.
Right.
However, what if we also make breakthroughs of a different sort, breakthroughs that are more fundamental and breakthroughs that are so important that we might not really be able to share them with the rest of the world? For instance, anti-gravity, some sort of field propulsion, electrogravitics, revolutions maybe in biotechnology if we had the access to study alien bodies. It might just so happen that our superiors might not allow us to share these breakthroughs with the rest of the world. After all, one of them might take down the petroleum industry if we found a substitute for petroleum, right? And so that's the world's largest industry. And so what I conceive might realistically happen is that this secret world of ours would continue to study these breakthroughs in private, secretly, and very possibly racing far ahead from the rest of the world that doesn't have access to this information. And after all, this is not an unusual topic when you look at the classified world in general. Everybody knows that America's National Security Agency is decades ahead of the rest of the world in computational capability. I spoke to an NSA scientist who worked there back in the mid-1960s who told me point blank that back then NSA computers had a processing speed of about 650 megahertz. Now today that's really not very impressive, but
right.
that's about 35 years ahead of the rest of the world. The rest of the world didn't achieve that clock speed until around 2000. So let's assume that there's ET technology that's being studied, and we really are obligated to ask how far ahead might they be from us? Would they have developed anti-gravity types of technologies, off-world capabilities? If so, then what we really might be talking is a group that is so far beyond the rest of us. If they have the ability to go off-world, they would know things. They would interact possibly with these other entities in ways that we perhaps cannot. In other words, it would give their world, their classified world, such a distinctive feel that they might in fact be considered genuinely a separate civilization, one that has broken away from our own, hence breakaway civilization. This is how I conceive this idea. It doesn't mean necessarily that they exist completely in isolation from the rest of us.
Mm-hmm.
After all, I would imagine they have family. They have mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and so forth. They have family reunions, and so I conceive of it as a kind of situation where they have one foot in this very different kind of world, and still another foot back in the world that we all live in.
So, Richard, you're not talking about this from the point of view that they might have taken their entire family with them, and they might actually either live on a space station at this point, or maybe even on another planet with the aid of this technology. But we're probably looking at personnel that is going back and forth then between the Earth and this other place wherever they're at.
Well, right, very well. But I think at the very least that is what we're looking at. Now, it can be, I would say conceivably, a case where some of these individuals might live full-time or close to full-time, and they might indeed have families there. But my understanding, now I'm telling you what I tell you for several reasons. One, and first and foremost, is that my own research of open literature has taken me into this direction. But secondarily, I can tell you, I've spoken with a few individuals that have given me very good reason to believe that they are part of this type of scenario, that they interact or are part of this breakaway group or civilization. And really, I think of it more and more as a kind of extreme version of the classified world in general. After all, you think of people who have deep black assignments, and they may be gone from their families for 4 or 5 or 6 months at a time or more. And I think the same type of thing happens here. And in those cases, it's very difficult to have a marriage. It's very difficult to have normal relationships with the outside world just because of the nature of their work. And so I think it's very likely that these types of individuals would have relationships with each other, and they would start families and so forth. I think that is a very likely scenario. I certainly don't assume that I have all of the information on this. But I do think that based on the kinds of leaks that have occurred from the classified world in terms of the technologies that we appear to have, in terms of the off-world capability that I do believe exists, all of these things tell me that what that clandestine world has are capabilities so vastly beyond what officially they're supposed to have, that yes, indeed, they are decidedly different. I mean, we can only guess at the kind of worldview that some of these people have and how they might look at the rest of us. As people, well, the ordinary humans know nothing. We're the ones who know what's going on. I can certainly see that kind of arrogance sort of working its way into their worldview.
Yeah. Richard, is the whole theory, it hinges on the fact that we're talking about some kind of crashed UFO, meaning ET, extraterrestrial technology, or is it still also possible that we might be talking about a group or project-run organization that actually has developed some of these technologies on their own with some of the inventions, right, here from Earth?
Correct. It does not hinge on Roswell, or it does not hinge on acquired ET technology, although it is my own assessment at this point that is in fact what's happened. And the reason it doesn't hinge on that is simply because of the evidence we have of such anomalies in space right now and of advanced technologies that exist. So wherever they come from, they're here. Think of it this way. One thing that is, in my view, not open to debate is the fact that military jets chase UFOs. They chased them back in ancient times, like the 1940s and 50s, and they chase them currently. Here in the United States, there are a number of confirmed cases in which F-16s and other types of interceptors have gone after what can only be called UFOs. So there's a phenomenon that's absolutely real. These objects belong to somebody. They're somebody's product, whether a clandestine human group or a non-human group. Either way, those objects belong to somebody. And it's evident to me that let's put it this way, if they're made by a human group, then that is de facto proof of a breakaway civilization, because they're working with concepts and technologies that we don't have. And if it's not the product of a human group, if they are ET, let's say, it doesn't matter in my view. because what it would indicate to me is that there are deeply clandestine projects to study and obviously to replicate that type of technology. In other words, we know that there are, at least we know within reason, that there are secret programs to try to create flying saucer technology. And I think that would qualify as such a breakaway civilization.
Now, in your books, you have been doing this very methodically and very well in terms of the timeline, obviously. You have, in the first one, UFOs and the national security state. You have a chronology of the cover-up going from 41 to 73. And as far as I understand it, it's in your second book, The Cover-Up Exposed, and this goes into from 73 to 91, that you begin to talk about the breakaway civilization, propose some of these ideas here.
That's exactly.
But how long has this been going on then? I mean, if we look at, Farrell, Hoagland, some of the other people out there, they talk about World War II being in a defining point in terms of when this actually was instigated. Do you agree with that, or do you have a different assessment of this?
No, I think that I do agree. When I wrote the first book about 10 years ago, I just had really not formulated this concept. So it was something that really came to me quite a bit later. I see the things really taking off during the 1950s, not so much in the 40s. And I think it happened, I think vast strides were made during the 1950s and into the early 60s in terms of this type of capability, simply due to the analysis and study of retrieved UFO technology from Roswell, and it appears to me other instances as well, in which clandestine groups got their hands on technology that was not made by human hands. So, I mean, roughly speaking, I think that I agree that the takeoff point was similar. I wouldn't put it quite as early as World War II, but I think the immediate aftermath is about right.
So let's talk a little bit about the budgets here then, and where some of the money is coming from. There is, obviously, as you mentioned, the black ops, the black budgets are out there. There's even different organizations that is watching this, like for instance the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment is one of them. Wired magazine have had articles about I think it was about how last year or 2010 there was about 58 billion that was put away for some of these programs. And obviously the question here is where is the money coming from, who is supplying it, and maybe even tying into that, we could talk about NASA a little bit. What are they doing, and how much of their money is actually going into some of these programs, do you think, Richard?
Well, I think there's two different ways that we have to understand the black budget. One is the official way, which is, for example, in the Wired magazine. I think they mentioned $56 billion, so it's very, very close to your number. But then there's, I think, what I would call the real black budget. Officially speaking, the black budget comes from tax appropriations, tax dollars. So, and officially speaking, the black budget is simply that part of the Pentagon's budget that is not publicly described. So, in other words, the Pentagon's budget is something like over $700 billion for. My God, it's even saying it is almost giving me a heart attack. $700 billion for, I think, fiscal year 2011, I think. And of that, 56 billion, or just under less than a tenth, is black, meaning that its uses are classified. Now, there are other ways of understanding black money. One of my personal heroes is a lady named Catherine Austin Fitts. I think many people who study this type of phenomenon are familiar with this person. Catherine Austin Fitts was a senior member of the administration of George Bush Sr. Back about 20 years ago. She's since done a great deal of work on the black budget, and her analysis, and she's written many, many pieces on this, indicate that what we call the black budget isn't just from tax dollars. It comes from a variety of sources, including narcotics trafficking proceeds, and also including what we would call securities fraud or stock market fraud, financial fraud of different types. Think back, for instance, just a little over 20 years ago, there was the great scandal known as the BCCI scandal. And this was a banking scandal involving the CIA. what they had was a bank that was based out of Australia, which had a network of money laundering. I'm thinking of Nugan Hand. That's another CIA financial scandal. Mm-hmm. BCCI was yet another one. And so what happens is these are money laundering operations that are very closely connected to narcotics trafficking. Think of it this way: narco trafficking is probably one of the top 5 industries in the world. Number 1 is petroleum, probably. Up there are weapons, and up there are automotive, and up there is narcotics. Now, one of these happens to be illegal, and that's narcotics, but that doesn't mean that no one wants it. Everyone wants the money, whether you're the CIA or the Mossad or the Pakistani ISI or the Chase Bank of New York or some cop on the take or some drug dealer on the streets corners. That everyone wants the money. It's particularly valuable to intelligence agencies because it's unvouchered. It's just cash that you don't have to account for, as long as you have the ability to launder it properly. And so this is also involved in our black budget, and it just never gets fully accounted for. What it certainly looks like is that the laundering capabilities for all of this illegal money, it's not simply banks. It's government agencies. Here in the United States, it's federal and state government agencies where money gets laundered through these a variety of places so that it looks clean and it can be used. Yeah. And so, what is the true black budget? Well, I'm not sure if we're really able to know that number. One thing I do know is that within the U.S. Pentagon structure, we have a system of secrecy that is utterly out of control, in which even the secretaries of the various branches of the military, for example, the Secretary of the U.S. Navy, stated just a couple of years ago that he was unable to keep track of the sheer number of black budget programs that were springing out of the Navy like mushrooms in a forest, here and there and here and there. And not even knowing who's controlling these things, much less Congress. Yeah. Congress has no ability to control it, but even the Secretary of the Navy can't seem to control the Navy programs. And the same is true with Army and within the CIA and all of these other labyrinthian elements within the U.S. structure. I just think we're in a position where we just really don't know where a lot of this money comes from.
A classic, obviously, that people will recall is this the Rumsfeld comment, pre 9/11 on the 10th, 2001, about the Pentagon, 2.1 or 3 whatever trillions of dollars lost, blah blah blah. Yeah,
precisely what he said. This was in July of 2001, before the Armed Services Committee in the House of Representatives. Now this is about 6 weeks or so before 9/11, when he first stated that the Pentagon was unable to track. It was $2.6 trillion in transactions, he said. That was his initial statement. Now that's 8 times the budget of the Pentagon at that time. It was about $310 billion. So that number was amended then to $2.3 trillion a few months later. And then now here's the thing about that. Now, I'm not an accountant, but I've done some research into this to try to understand what exactly he meant. And partly what he meant, this is certainly not to defend the Pentagon or to deny that there's theft, but what they meant was the Pentagon had at the time roughly something like 500 different computer systems, accounting systems, throughout the Pentagon.
That's right.
And what they tried to do is to have reconciliations when you balance your checkbook. You have to reconcile the payments. And it was utterly impossible to reconcile so many of the transactions that it amounted to in the trillions of dollars. That's not the same thing as admitting that the money just disappeared.
True.
The money did not fully disappear. Now here's where it becomes implausible. Over the next number of years, the Pentagon accountants tried to work on this number, and they reduced it. So the following year, I think they say they got it down to something like 700 billion or half $500 billion only. So,
Much better.
as if that's not a lot of money. But now, where they really lost me is when a few years after that they said that they got the discrepancy down to 0. Now, as I see it, that's like a child in school who fails every class every year, who then doesn't want his parents to know that he failed math yet again. So he takes his report card and changes the F not to a D or a C, but to an A. This is what we call this is what we call getting greedy and not knowing how to lie credibly. So clearly, obviously, some senior general at the Pentagon must have just said, "I want that number down to 0, damn it!" And of course they just made it happen. It's just not credible. So clearly, there's a great deal of missing money. We can certainly say safely that there are many billions of dollars that have gone missing and go missing all the time out of the United States government's budget, and I think probably much more.
Absolutely, and also, by the way, for those people out there who want to take a look at that, I'll link it up, because Rumsfeld was actually questioned about this money in a recent video that somebody took of a meeting where they met him, and he he claimed obviously that no, it was just lost in the system, just as you say, Richard, and they found it all, so it's good, you know, basically.
Well, yeah, he said they found it all, which that's just not believable.
Yeah,
it's a statement that I think has, deserves attention, but I think in some ways we give it the wrong kind of attention. And by the way, the Rumsfeld statement wasn't the first that referred to trillions of dollars in wrong transaction. Starting in the early 1990s, I think during the Clinton administration, there was a law passed in Congress that essentially demanded that the United States government account for itself in a so-called business-like manner. And so starting from that period, I think the first story of like trillions of dollars that went missing started around 1994, 95. And there were periodically a number of these stories that came out through the 1990s, 1.1 trillion here, 2 trillion there, and so on. And then Rumsfeld, I think, famously made this statement in 2001. But he wasn't the only one. So, you know, it's important for us, yes, to hold these governments accountable, obviously, but it's also important for us to try to understand this realistically. I mean, think of it this way. Rumsfeld is not so stupid that he's just going to make this statement. I mean, that amount was 8 times the Pentagon's budget for that year.
Yeah.
So there's no way he's just going to say to Congress, "Oh yeah, we lost 8 times our budget, and we have no idea where it went." Obviously, I don't even see how that's possible. But it's also the case that many billions of dollars do go missing. And one other thing that I would point out in this context, I referred to Catherine Austin Fitts a little earlier. Well, she, for 4 years, was the number 2 person at an important federal agency called Housing and Urban Development, or HUD for short. And HUD has been notoriously corrupt for many, many years. She mentions that when she came into HUD for the first time, as the number 2 person, and a real accounting whiz, that's her background is finance, her first statement was that she wanted to see the HUD budget and was told that she wasn't authorized to see it. And her response was, say what? I'm not authorized? Yes, I'm certainly authorized, and you're going to show me it. Well, it took many, many weeks. She finally succeeded, and her story is comical and also frightening at the same time. She said, well, when they brought in the financial data on HUD, they wheeled it in, you know, like in the old-fashioned library carts where they carry all the books. I don't know if they have, they must have something like this.
Yep, I know what you mean.
These huge wheeled carts, they wheeled in cart after cart filled with stacks of papers and books. She said, when I looked at it, I realized that it would be impossible. I mean, literally impossible to audit this department.
Yeah.
And she determined that this was how it was meant to be, that it was literally an impossibility to do a proper audit of HUD. And that's 80+% of the United States government that it's probably impossible to do a proper audit of. So the money just flows through. It just flows through, much of it illegal.
Absolutely. By the way, we'll link up. We have an interview with Catherine Austin-Fitz in our archive from 2009 that we'll link up. But it's the same thing here in the European Union, actually. Martha Andreasen, who was an MEP and the financial... she was actually the chief accountant of the European Union, and she refused to sign off the accounts several years in a row because of the corruption. And she also claimed similar thing. There was like erroneous computer systems that were not allowed to be updated by certain people in order to kind of justify money being, lost in the system pretty much. So, but let's move on a little bit here, Richard, then, and ask, obviously, what kind of, toys have been developed with all of this money that we're talking about here?
Absolutely. This is a key question to ask. It's not simply that all this money has gone missing, but what's being done with it. Well, clearly, one of the goals of this program has been to create their own flying saucer, let's say. I think that the evidence shows that at least from the 1960s onwards, that there have been functional flying saucers that have been built within the United States, within their black budget infrastructure. There's a photograph from 1966 near a town called Provo, Utah. This is actually very close to Dugway Proving Grounds in the state of Utah, out west, out in the middle of the Rockies, out middle of nowhere, essentially. The photograph was very close to Dugway. It is a classic-looking flying saucer. It looks very much like a model that was built about 20 years later and filmed out in the area of Area 51. The so-called ARV video, the alien reproduction video, that was actually from 1995, so 30 years later. But this Provo photograph from 1966 is nearly identical in its appearance, as far as I can tell. So its proximity to a major U.S. secret installation or classified installation, as well as its physical appearance is something that we know we built 30 years later, gives me reason to think that we were building these flying saucers as early as the mid-1960s. And certainly, think of it this way. If we, were part of this breakaway civilization that uncovered, that really made a breakthrough in electrogravitics and anti-gravity type technology, we really wouldn't be able to share it with the rest of the world. After all, such an object obviously doesn't use petroleum to move from point A to point B.
Right.
And so whatever it's using would eviscerate the petroleum industry almost immediately. I mean, there goes the world's largest business.
Yeah.
And within a couple of years, it would be a shell of what it is today. That might be a great thing for you and me and for most of the world, but it's not a great thing for the wealthy individuals who have trillions of dollars of investment in it.
And even what I've been contemplating is how easy would a transition over to an alternative fuel actually be? Think about it this way. A politician, let's say, then take the initiative, bring something new in, let's say the oil industry, and look at the whole car industry, look at the whole mechanic industry. There's millions and millions of jobs out there that are depending on this now. And if a politician would have come in there and said, okay, let's try this new thing, he would put millions and millions of people out of work, and there would be massive protests, and he would be actually to blame for it. I mean, how do we transition from one thing over to the other, Richard?
Well, absolutely. And this is something that I've been trying to explore in the very most recent book that I've written. I co-authored a book called AD After Disclosure. It is an exploration of how the world realistically might look after the end of UFO secrecy. I mean, after all, look, this is a secret that cannot last forever. It cannot last forever. We as a society are on the fast track here. Think about the transformation of human civilization in the last 100 years, in the last 50 years, and what we might look like in another 50 years. Clearly, I just read an article today on key advances in quantum computing. Quantum computing is one of the key drivers of our future here. That artificial intelligence and also nanotech are really some of the three of the key technologies that are going to be moving us into a completely different world within another generation or two at the most. And so what is our world going to look like? Well, one thing it's going to look like is it's going to have, it seems to me, an open acknowledgement of an ET presence here on Earth. And the reason that I say this is that our capabilities as a society are transforming in terms of our ability to gather information, communicate that information with each other, are developing almost exponentially, it seems to me. And in such a future situation, it just seems to me ludicrous to think that we will not be any farther along in exposing once and for all the nature of the UFO phenomenon. Think of something like WikiLeaks, which has really only existed for the past 4 years or so. I mean, beyond 4 years ago, WikiLeaks almost really wasn't possible just because we didn't have quite the electronic infrastructure, but we've got it now. And WikiLeaks could be, or one of its copycat organizations might be something that breaks the UFO secret, or a sighting that occurs, but now tracked with multiple HD flip phone cameras and the like that will have the ability to make the breakthrough. So what I'm saying is, whether we like it or not, we're going to have to make a transition to this new reality. And once the UFO reality is out in the open, the end of the petroleum era is going to be very, very soon. And making that transition will be difficult. You look back historically. I was just recently studying the transition of Britain from wood to coal back to a little over 250 years ago. It was not easy to do. You know, Britain had coal technology, was very well understood roughly about 3 centuries ago, but they didn't have the infrastructure, not even close, to implement that right away. It took several generations of concerted effort to develop that infrastructure. And then going from coal to petroleum also was not an immediate thing. All of this took time. And so to go from petroleum to post-petroleum is going to be especially difficult because I imagine it might happen very rapidly, and it would be a very destabilizing thing. You've got completely, unlike the earlier years, going from wood to coal was not such a big deal because much of the world didn't have to deal with that all at once. Ditto going from coal to petroleum. But now the entire world, the entire globe, there's not a place on this world that's not using petroleum and that's not interconnected with every other part of the world. And so the transition is going to have to be global, and it's going to have to be coordinated. This is a political nightmare. It's an economic nightmare. But it's going to happen nonetheless. It's no parent is ever ready truly for their first child, but that doesn't stop the child from being born.
That's right.
So we're all going to have to learn to deal with this, and I don't think it's going to be fun or even satisfactory in many ways, but that's
just the way it is.
It is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a very interesting point that you bring this up, and we can see the beginning of a transition in various different industries. And one very small example, but still pretty good one, is the idea of, all the plastic bottles, all the petroleum and all the plastic that is out there. When PepsiCo now a few days ago released an article that they were actually switching from their plastic to, they made bottles from grass and bark and corn husk and all kinds of weird things, and it looks the same and things like that.
Interesting.
Which is kind of interesting because we might see also a transition over in the various different industries independently from this. Again, it might not be a centralized, global initiative that is being taken here, if you know what I mean.
That's an excellent point. And, the thing that's useful to remember here is that human society, with or without a UFO phenomenon, is going to have to move to a post-petroleum era. We don't really have any choice. It looks now that many of the peak oil theorists have actually really been right in their fundamentals. Some of the WikiLeaks cables that have recently been released indicate that Middle Eastern oil executives, for instance, have taken peak oil for granted. In other words, they understand that it's a reality. And also there is indication to believe that some of the Middle Eastern oil reserves have been overstated, inflated, as it were, unrealistically so, and so that the amounts that are in these proven reserves might be substantially lower than we thought. That being said, we as a globe are going to have to deal with this because global demand for petroleum has only been increasing. It's not just Europe and North America now, and South America, China, India, Russia. All of these people want to drive cars. Everyone wants oil. We're sucking it down faster and faster than ever before. And so what are we going to do with ever-increasing demand and a supply that is very possibly peaking right now? Obviously, we're in for some seriously difficult economic times. Historically speaking, economic growth hinges directly on the availability and cost of energy. So if you have abundant, cheap energy, no question about it, you will have economic growth. If energy is not abundant and it's expensive, you will not have economic growth. And so as a global economy, we damn well better find a way to get abundant energy. And as a global environment, a global ecology, we damn well better find a way to get clean energy. And petroleum is not going to satisfy either of those needs. And so we need to find a post-petroleum solution pronto. And the reason that the UFO phenomenon is so important, it's not just some abstract scientific, what if there are aliens out there type of idea.
Right.
That's the least of it. The reason it matters is because these objects demonstrate that they represent a post-petroleum solution to our problem. That is what makes them so essential. That is why the recent conference in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, I think should have been so important. Unfortunately, I never got a sense that anyone there was really talking about these issues in a sophisticated way in terms of the UFO phenomenon. That is, understanding UFOs as a post-petroleum solution.
Yeah.
And that's really what matters. And if we're not talking about that, we're just wasting our time.
That's right. And even if the whole, abiotic oil theory is true or not, I still think at the end of it that it's a good idea also to start, rethinking this, because again, I mean, the energy is very expensive. It is
right.
Whether or not you're believing in the whole global warming issue, it's still a lot of other poisons in the gasoline that we're using. So
even if oil is abiotic, and we have to emphasize that this is a very small minority position, but let's say it's true, all right. It really doesn't change the dynamic all that much. First of all, we're having a difficulty. You've got to find the way to drill deep enough down to get it. Now, even if you can do that, even if you have an abundant supply, we really have to ask ourselves realistically, how many more years can human society coexist with the rest of the global environment using petroleum as its main source of energy? We're destroying. We are literally destroying the ability of Earth to sustain us with petroleum as our main source of energy. We must not. For another century, to me, it's inconceivable that we would have a global human population worldwide using petroleum as its main source of energy. I think we're looking at a definite cascading failure of our global ecosystem if we continue.
Yeah. Okay, let's address another point here, Richard, which has to do with this alternative power energy source that we're talking about here as well. Because obviously with energy comes power, meaning weaponry, other things like this. And the question is, could we be looking at a situation right now as well? They're reluctant to release some of the technology because it also means that other people would get their hands on this technology, which would consequently lead to other things. When we, weaponry, for instance, is there a real issue? Yeah.
Yes, I think it is. You're hitting all of the points that have often kept me awake at night when I think about this. For instance, let's assume that there's a couple of answers here that produce the energy behind UFOs. It could be hot fusion, that is a controlled nuclear fusion, which we have not ever achieved, and that this is one of the holy grails of modern physics. What we have in our nuclear technology today is fission, which does a pretty good job. It produces a lot of energy, but it also produces radioactivity, as we're seeing now in Japan.
Yep.
That's very dangerous. Fusion is different. Nuclear fusion is exactly what the sun does. Now, we do it when we explode a hydrogen bomb, but that's not a controlled process. But in controlled fusion, which is believed to be possible, it's an exponentially greater amount of energy generated, and it's clean because the byproduct is simply helium, which is inert and very clean. It's quite possible that flying saucer technology would be able to use this type of fusion as its primary source of energy, and that would create the electrogravitic power and so forth that allows it to do what it does. There's also cold fusion, which I don't rule out. I mean, that was considered something of a joke 20 years ago. I'm not so sure it's a joke today.
That's right.
And then there are somewhat more exotic theories like zero-point energy, which many people have discussed. And it certainly could be that 0 point is an answer too. The point is, however, any of these solutions could very well be dangerous if they are not controlled and regulated. Dr. Harold Putoff, who is one of the experts in 0 point, famously said that within a cup of coffee there might be a little insignificant amount of energy in the 0 point field, or there might be enough energy to blow up the entire Pacific Ocean. Mm. Now, if it's the latter, we certainly need a way to monitor and control this. And so what we've got is a political nightmare and the necessity to have a global regulation of this energy source. There's really no way around it. Here in the United States, there's a very strong movement to like an anti-globalist movement, anti-New World Order.
Yeah.
Hey, I am totally sympathetic to that. I do not like the way that the New World Order is shaping up, which essentially is ruled by a very, very few people who own all the resources of the world. However, I think it's a fool's game to assume to pretend that we are not going to globalize. The world has been globalizing for at least the last 500 years. It's not going to stop now. We're in a world of internet, of cell phones, of total interconnectivity, and we must, or we're idiots if we don't have some kind of global system that will coordinate all of these in an equitable, fair way. The point about globalization is not is it going to happen, but how is it going to look?
Yeah, and who's going to be behind it? Yeah.
Precisely. Is it going to look like fascism, or is it going to look something like freedom? And that is our choice.
Yeah.
And I do believe that we have opportunities here to make it look something like freedom. There are ways, I think, of instituting public control over these institutions so that they are responsive to people. But what is going to be necessary, it seems to be no way around it, is to institute a fair global system that is going to allow us to transition smoothly to a post-petroleum world, and also to manage the threat posed by these beneficial but potentially dangerous technologies. We can't just let anyone use them for their own purposes, because many people are very good, and there are people who truly are malevolent and kind of crazy, and they'll do shit. they'll mess us up.
That's right.
And I don't want to give them the opportunity to do that.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's a good point, and it's valid, and that could be one of the bottlenecks here as well. Obviously, that is keeping things from just going the way we want it. We might sit here a little bit on the outside, if you will, then and look in and say, "Oh, come on, why don't you do it quicker? We want it now."
Right.
But we might not contemplate all the problems that actually are going to arise because of it. But the question, though, here is, Richard, is this the page that the people who are behind the secret space program are they on the same page as us on this point? What is their philosophy? What is driving them, do you think?
Excellent question. What I will only tell you what I suspect is going on. My suspicion, my view of the whole scenario of our current world is sort of as follows. I think that humanity right now is of intense interest to a variety of intelligences that have the ability to come here and to observe us, and to some extent to interact with us and to interact with our world. I happen to think that humanity right now is, as it were, the greatest show in this quadrant of the galaxy. and the reason is that we've made this leap in just really the last century or two into a scientifically based civilization that has been able exponentially to increase its own technological capabilities. And in another generation or two or three, realistically, I think we might just be leaping into their world. And I think that they know this. And so that fact has brought a number of these groups here to observe us. So having said that, we now have this, what I call the breakaway civilization. And what I think is going on is that this group is, to some extent or another, trying to deal with this challenge, with the presence of these other beings that are here. And so I suspect that they do have the ability to go off-world. There is some probable interaction with these other entities. Whether these entities are positive or negative to us, I think, in fact, it could be both. It could be a variety of agendas that we're dealing with here. My suspicion is that the classified group of secret keepers, let's say the majestic group, if you want to call them that, I think that they may, in fact, be having a difficult time dealing with this challenge, for all I know. And they may despair in thinking, how can they ever possibly tell the rest of the world about what's going on? They may feel that the world is just not ever going to be ready for it, which is true. The world is never going to be ready. But again, as I've been maintaining, it doesn't matter, because the real dynamic in this equation isn't the other beings, and it's not even the breakaway civilization. The true dynamic is us, we, the people of the world, because it's us that are changing so rapidly. Our own technological capabilities are developing so rapidly. I think that we are going to be in a position within another generation where we will be forcing this secret out. And once this reality is on the table, well, it's a new world.
So what have happened in terms of space travel and the developments there? Because I would agree with you on the page if we talk about computers, cell phones, other certain things. But as we've been talking about, obviously here in terms of petroleum, driven vehicles, nothing has happened. Not much have happened in terms of the regular flights that we take in terms of kerosene, the fuel there and stuff. And NASA hasn't been back to the moon in, how long is it now? 50, 60 years? What is happening there?
Well, 40 years.
40,
quite some time. Yeah. Well, right. We have the open space program and we have a secret space program, and perhaps it's ne'er shall the twain meet. I think they're two distinct entities. In fact, this was told to me explicitly by former NASA engineer Clark McClelland, who spent more than 35 years as with NASA, and he became a certified space shuttle commander. His claim is that there is indeed a secret space program. There are people in NASA who are aware of this. There are many in NASA who are not aware of it. But that fundamentally, NASA is more or less a public relations exercise. It has been valuable for placing some satellites in orbit, but that it's not really doing an awful lot in terms of the actual space program. The claim is, and I think it's possible that this is true, that there is a fleet of off-world vehicles, whether these are maybe the black triangles that we've taught, that many suspect, or a different type of craft that have the ability to go off-world, and that includes the moon, and that might even include Mars.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to keep this in mind. After all, look, think of it just logically. If I remember early on in my research, 10 years ago or more, I didn't back then take so seriously the possibility that there were true anomalies on the moon or Mars. That changed once I started speaking to a number of PhDs and scientists within the classified world, and I discovered that they were taking those anomalies very seriously. And that made me realize that there might be something there after all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now I'm quite satisfied that yes, indeed, there are things about the Mars and there are things about the moon that do not make sense from a conventional point of view. They are true anomalies that are probably signs of artificial of intelligence, right? And so if you assume that that's the case, and you've got this secret program to study the UFO phenomenon, well, clearly that's a major incentive to develop a secret space program. You wouldn't want to study those anomalies with the public watching you because you have no idea what you'd find.
That's right.
And that would open up the entire UFO field, and that's absolutely not something that they desire. So you would have to have a secret space program to investigate that, and I think that's what some of these black triangles are used for.
So could it be that the space program have just been going on and on and on because they've been finding more and more and more, and they're trying to find out how deep the rabbit hole goes, so to speak, in one sense.
Yes.
Because I want you to, if you can, tie in this aspect of some of the things that Gary McKinnon found as well, and because he pointed to the U.S. Space Command in some of his intrusions, or whatever you want to call it, into some of the NASA computers. Non-terrestrial officers, off-world personnel. Is this a military program then?
Yeah, it has to be military to some extent, but I would say not exclusively military. My interpretation of the U.S. military these days is that it really serves the function of international financial interests. So that, I mean, think of it this way: the U.S. military is really like the police force or the security force for this program, but doesn't necessarily have the real operational authority over it. Right. It's working for other groups. Lest someone doubt this, all one has to do is look at the nation of Iraq, which has something like $30 trillion worth of oil in the ground, and all of which, or nearly all of which now in the last 3, 4, 5 years, has been gobbled up by multinational corporations. Back in the bad old days of Saddam Hussein, that oil was all controlled and owned by the state of Iraq, which meant that it paid for the entire nation's infrastructure. That's no longer the case. And so, and all those companies that have bought up the oil, they're not even American. They're the largest one, I believe, is Malaysian, and then there's Turkish and Chinese companies and so forth. And so, if nothing else, to me, that is tantamount to proof that the United States military has gone in killing and getting killed, laying waste to a nation. For what? So that multinational corporations can buy the trillions of dollars of oil and own that oil. And that's what it's about all along. And so it's the same. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, I just want to say, and the United States obviously get the blame for this, right? Because they're the attack dog of this global elite in one way.
But the U.S. military is simply used because it's the most dominant military in the world, and it's not really there for my benefit as an American citizen.
That's right.
It's not there to help American people. It's there to help international financial elites who need to get that thing done.
And we see it in Libya unfolding before our eyes again. It's incredible, isn't it?
That's exactly right. Certainly, one has a great deal of sympathy for the people of Libya and who've lived under an autocratic regime for more than 40 years. But clearly, what's at stake there is control over Libyan oil.
Yeah,
and it's essential from the point of view of the financial elites that are running the show to maintain to have friendly control over that oil. That's their number one priority. Everything else is secondary. Back to the space program, though, I just want to finish making this point. Sure. I brought this up. Who's running it? Yeah, the U.S. military, I think, has a dominant presence there. But who do they answer to? This is the real question. I think it's fair to say that they do not answer to the President of the United States, who is, officially speaking, the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. What we have is a situation in which these black budget programs, they're often known as special access programs, are dominated not by the public government officials, but rather they are dominated by the private entities, the private contractors that run them. And we've seen this in a number of studies now about black budget programs. And I think it's exactly the same type of situation regarding the entire UFO structure, and certainly regarding the secret space program. I think what we have are private interests that are involved in this, simply because it's the most cutting-edge, advanced technological reality of our world, and they are not going to want to be left out of it.
That's right. So we only have time for an hour here today, so unfortunately we have to begin to round it up in a little while here, but most certainly we need to continue our discussion at some point here. There's so many more questions and so forth that I have for you as well, Richard, but there's a few more things here before we wrap things up then, and one of this aspect is that I know that you are going into as well, is that the relationship, if I put it that way, of many of these so-called UFOs in space might not be the best either. It might not be harmonious, if I put it that way. You've shown STS-48 footage and other things as well in some of your presentations, where you give the idea that there might also be a kind of a war in space unfolding as well between different factions, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think it's possible. Now, the STS-48 footage, I do still tend to think that this shows an anomalous event in space, although I'm not 100% sure about that, but I am sure that there are no shortage of events that show hostile action between conventional military forces and UFOs. This, there is no doubt. We have it within the public domain that there have been instances in which jet fighters have fired on these UFOs, going back to the 1950s and much more recently as well. So there's as I sometimes put it, trouble in paradise. There's a confrontational relationship that is going on between, let's say, us and them, putting it very loosely. I also think the few sources that I've been able to talk with, and in fact, some of these deep inside sources I haven't really heard from in some time, but I was given unofficially reason to think that there could very well be various human groups and various non-human groups in different types of loose alliances. So that, in other words, there may not just be one human group with a deep interest in this, just like in the world of the intelligence community, the old James Bond movies where you've got spy versus spy. I think the impression that I've gotten is that a similar kind of situation exists within the the world of UFO secrecy, that there are different, and what they compete over is control over and access to science and technology, among other things, that this is very important for them, and that they may in fact have interactions that may be positive with some of these other groups. That's a little more vague in terms of the sources that I've spoken to, but certainly there's a long history of claims of people seeing interaction between human and non-human groups on various facilities. I think that could be true.
Very, very interesting indeed. It's very difficult on the ground, obviously, to know what actually is going on, as it were, up there in space, and what the motives are, and which groups are fighting, clearly, and all that. Yeah.
The last thing that I probably would say in this hour is that it's very important for us to distinguish between what we absolutely know is true and what we think things might be. I'm very happy to speculate about a lot of these things, but I would not want to mislead someone or pretend that I know for sure about some of this. What I do know is that this is a phenomenon, that is UFOs. That's a real phenomenon, and that because conventional military aircraft have had confrontational relationships with these for over 60 years, that tells me that these are probably not of our civilization. That and a lot of other things about it lead me to think that these are not human in origin. So that being said, I think that's a fairly solid argument. Secret space program, I think, is one that is logical and that is based. It's a logical conclusion based on some of the evidence that we have. Something that would qualify as proof. Well, the best thing that we have are some very interesting video footage showing things in space, doing things that defy all common sense. So that tells me that there's something going on in space that is very, very advanced.
Indeed. Richard Dolan, you will be in Amsterdam on April 3rd. That's a Sunday. A little bit less than 2 weeks to go now here, together with Richard Hoagland, Timothy Good, and Peter Levenda. We urge all our listeners to go over to secretspaceprogram.com. Take a look at the speakers, some of the topics, and obviously get your tickets and join us. I think that this will be a really, really interesting conference where we possibly can get closer to some of these ideas by collaborating and elaborating on some of these points further, watching the presentations and so forth as well. And I guess you will obviously continue in this general veneer, Richard. You will go into some of these aspects as well in your presentation, right?
Most definitely, I certainly will. The themes that you and I have discussed this afternoon are very much in line with what I will be talking about when I'm in Amsterdam in 2 weeks, which I'm very much looking forward to.
Absolutely. It is going to be great. And obviously we want to talk about your material a bit as well before we wrap things up here, Richard. The books you have out there currently, UFOs and the National Security State, Chronology of Cover-Up, 1941 to 73. That's the first one. Then The Cover-Up Exposed from 73 to 91, kind of volume 2 of that one. And then also AD, After Disclosure, The People's Guide to Life After Contact. Didn't you co-write this with Bryce Zabel, the creator of the Dark Sky series?
That's exactly right. Yes, we did. And that book was written throughout most of 2010, just last year. Writing that book was a great adventure in my life. It was a great intellectual adventure. So much of what's in there is very fresh, I have to say. Things, ideas that I think had not been raised in any substantial way previously. There's been talk about disclosure for years, disclosure of the secret of UFOs, but a lot of it always struck me as very utopian in nature, promising this wonderful world, which there can be a lot of wonderful things coming out of it, but what I saw were a lot of challenges, and I wanted to really write in as pragmatic a way as I could. Impressive, but
right. That's
about 35 years ahead of the rest of the world. The rest of the world didn't achieve that clock speed until around 2000. So let's assume that there's ET technology that's being studied, and we really are obligated to ask how far ahead might they be from us? Would they have developed anti-gravity types of technologies, off-world capabilities? If so, then what we really might be talking is a group that is so far beyond the rest of us. If they have the ability to go off-world, they would know things. They would interact possibly with these other entities in ways that we perhaps cannot. In other words, it would give their world, their classified world, such a distinctive feel that they might in fact be considered genuinely a separate civilization, one that has broken away from our own, hence breakaway civilization. This is how I conceive this idea. It doesn't mean necessarily that they exist completely in isolation from the rest of us.
Mm-hmm.
After all, I would imagine they have family. They have mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and so forth. They have family reunions. And so I conceive of it as a kind of situation where they have one foot in this very different kind of world, and still another foot back in the world that we all live in.
So, Richard, you're not talking about this from the point of view that they might have taken their entire family with them, and they might actually either live on a space station at this point, or maybe even on another planet with the aid of this technology. But we're probably looking at personnel that is going back and forth then between the Earth and this other place wherever they're at.
Well, right, very well. But I think at the very least that a clandestine world has are capabilities so vastly beyond what officially they're supposed to have, that yes, indeed, they are decidedly different. I mean, we can only guess at the kind of world view that some of these people have and how they might look at the rest of us as, people. Well, the ordinary humans know nothing. We're the ones who know what's going on. I can certainly see that kind of arrogance sort of working its way into their worldview.
Yeah. Richard, is the whole theory it hinges on the fact that we're talking about some kind of crashed UFO, meaning ET, extraterrestrial technology, or is it still also possible that we might be talking about a group or project-run organization that actually has developed some of these technologies on their own with some of the inventions, right, here from Earth?
Correct. It does not hinge on Roswell, or it does not hinge on acquired ET technology, although it is my own assessment at this point that that is in fact what's happened. And the reason it doesn't hinge on that is simply because of the evidence we have of such anomalies in space right now and of advanced technologies that exist. So wherever they come from, they're here. Think of it this way. One thing that is, in my view, not open to debate is the fact that military jets chase UFOs. They chased them back in ancient times, like the 1940s and 50s, and they chase them currently. Here in the United States, there are a number of confirmed cases in which F-16s and other types of interceptors have gone after what can only be called UFOs. So there's a eureka moment where we might be able to make breakthroughs in our understanding of that technology. And some of these breakthroughs might allow us to make money off of our understanding. We might make better integrated circuits or high tensile fibers or fiber optics or things of this particular sort.
Right.
However, what if we also make breakthroughs of a different sort, breakthroughs that are more fundamental and breakthroughs that are so important that we might not really be able to share them with the rest of the world? For instance, anti-gravity, some sort of field propulsion, electrogravitics, revolutions maybe in biotechnology if we had the access to study alien bodies. It might just so happen that our superiors might not allow us to share these breakthroughs with the rest of the world. After all, one of them might take down the petroleum industry if we found a substitute for petroleum, right? And so that's the world's largest industry. And so what I conceive might realistically happen is that this secret world of ours would continue to study these breakthroughs in private, secretly, and very possibly racing far ahead from the rest of the world that doesn't have access to this information. And after all, this is not an unusual topic when you look at the classified world in general. Everybody knows that America's National Security Agency is decades ahead of the rest of the world in computational capability. I spoke to an NSA scientist who worked there back in the mid-1960s who told me point blank that back then NSA computers had a processing speed of about 650 megahertz. Now today that's really not very impressive. Absolutely, I would be very happy to. Well, think of it, in terms of what is a civilization to begin with. It's perhaps not something that's the easiest thing to measure, but I think we can all have a sense of what it entails. One thing would be a certain level of technology that might help define it. Another might be its idea of how the universe is structured, its cosmology, so to speak. Another might be its particular style of social beliefs and social interactions and so forth. And all of these types of things go in to make a distinctive civilization, I would argue. And in human history, we've had a variety of types of civilizations that have existed over the many millennia that we've had history. Now let's move into our own era and look at the clandestine black budget world that most of us are somewhat familiar with. This is a world that has a great deal of secret money that's gone into it. It has a great deal of secrecy and independence from much legal oversight. And as I also believe has come to happen is that this is a world, at least some segments of it, have acquired certain types of exotic technology, let's call it ET or alien technology, that they have been able to study for a number of decades now. So let's imagine that we are part of that organization. We're part of this black budget world, and it's 1950, and we're part of a team of brilliant scientists, and our job is to study certain pieces of alien technology. Now, within that situation, after a certain period of time, some of us would have what we're looking at. Now, it can be, I would say conceivably, a case where some of these individuals might live full-time or close to full-time, and they might indeed have families there. But my understanding, now I'm telling you what I tell you for several reasons. One, and first and foremost, is that my own research of open literature has taken me into this direction. But secondarily, I can tell you, I've spoken with a few individuals that have given me very good reason to believe that they are part of this type of scenario, that they interact or are part of this breakaway group or civilization. And really, I think of it more and more as a kind of extreme version of the classified world in general. After all, you think of people who have deep black assignments, and they may be gone from their families for 4 or 5 or 6 months at a time or more. And I think the same type of thing happens here. And in those cases, it's very difficult to have a marriage. It's very difficult to have normal relationships with the outside world just because of the nature of their work. And so I think it's very likely that these types of individuals would have relationships with each other, and they would start families and so forth. I think that is a very likely scenario. I certainly don't assume that I have all of the information on this, but I do think that based on the kinds of leaks that have occurred from the classified world in terms of the technologies that we appear to have, in terms of the off-world capability that I do believe exists, all of these things tell me that what that clandestine